Richard Dawkins's The God Delusion seems to heavily discredit the idea of a personal God as traditionally believed in by many religious people. He claims that the concept of God, especially that of the Jewish Bible, is both immoral and irrational from the perspective of science. As a scientist and religious believer, what is your view on these claims? For those of you who might not know about Richard Dawkins or about his book, so Richard Dawkins is an atheist biologist and an accomplished biologist in his own right as a scientist, and he sets out to write this particular book to discredit the idea that God, or at least the personal God of the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament, was any God to believe in whatsoever. And the thing that is important about this book is that it is an attempt to discredit the idea or concept of God for those who are scientists, and particularly of those who hold science in high regard. Now, Dawkins in this book, and I actually have read the book, and the thing about Dawkins's arguments, now again, the thing about arguments is that there is a certain logic to them of which should be able to be discerned and tested. There's no argument that can be made that can't be responded to. However, opinion can be simply said and have no response necessary. There are things that we can put out there that how we feel about certain subjects that are deeply personal, that are not seriously able to be challenged by someone else. After all, I don't know what this other person feels. However, when someone begins to make an argument for or against something, then one has to be very careful in examining what I'm arguing for or against, how I'm arguing for or against it, and to be willing to receive the necessary criticism to refine my argument. Now, John Polkinghorne and Nicholas Beale, and likewise many other Christians and Christian philosophers specifically who have taken a look at this book, have noticed something very important. The actual arguments within the book are either making errors in what the actual premises are that he's attempting to argue against, or are factually erroneous to begin with. Now, this is not applying to what his particular scientific biologist is saying about evolutionary biology. That's all well and good. We can argue and agree about a lot of those things, but the particular thing that's very interesting is that Dawkins's concept of what God is deeply erroneous as it comes to particularly the Jewish and Christian traditions. And likely I'd like to go ahead and put in the Islamic tradition as well. If you read the book, you'll notice, number one, as Nicholas Beale points out, it's not the God mistake, it's the God delusion. Delusion is a reference to a psychosis. In other words, that this is a diagnosis of being psychotic, and not in the violent way, but in the simply misguided way of actually not seeing the world correctly. In other words, Dawkins leads off the book with a pathological argument rather than a logical argument. It's not going head-on with the brightest and best of theism. It's caricaturing and strawmanning everything that is perhaps erroneous about some certain beliefs in God already. This is, by the way, the broad blanket statement of the God of the Old Testament as being an evil God, which is, by the way, something that the Christian tradition has already dealt with in the 2nd century. But the question that really one has to come to is, what does Dawkins think God is to begin with? Now, this is pointed out not necessarily directly by Nicholas Beale, but is pointed out by Bishop Robert Barron of the Roman Catholic Church, who, by the way, by his training as a philosopher, Dawkins is treating God as something to be observable and testable within the physical universe, and not to be completely separate from the universe. The problem with this particular approach to God is that Christians, and likewise those within Judaism, have never treated, in the deeply conceptual traditions, they've never treated God as an object within the universe, but rather as a being beyond the universe. Something of which we have really no analog for within creation except by degrees or by shades. Hence why we can say that humanity is created in the image of God, but is not the image of God itself. It's sort of like whenever you're trying to paint a portrait of someone, you can make it look as realistic as possible, and yet the portrait does not walk, talk, speak, or anything else like that. It's a mere photograph or facsimile of the real thing. The reason why this is important is because in the subsequent ways that Dawkins treats the subject of belief in God, it is subject to the error of treating God as analogical to things within the world. You can use this as either a constructivist argument, in other words, I construct meaning and I put God in the spot. This is sometimes called the God of the gaps theory, which Dawkins is particularly fond of bringing up in the book. The problem is that God of the gaps is more of an approach to the problem that we run into of reconciling the Genesis account with evolutionary biology, rather than an explanatory as to who God is. In other words, the things that we can't explain in the universe, simply stick God in there. That's what the God of the gaps theory is. Now, not only do Christians not look at God of the gaps theory with very kind regard anyway, but God of the gaps is not a shoehorned-in way of saying that if I don't understand it, then God did it. Because as Nicholas Beale and as Polkinghorne himself point out, there are certain things that we think we know about the universe that actually turn out to be false, and certain things that we do not know about the universe that are nonetheless real. We do not know how dark matter makes up a significant portion of the universe, and yet we know so very little about it. That does not mean that dark matter doesn't exist, but it simply means that we simply don't know a lot about it. Likewise, there was a biological assumption within evolutionary biology that the popular way of talking about this is the survival of the fittest, which that in of itself does not mean what you probably think it means, but to use it in the more caricatured sort of way, that the selfishness, the self-serving, is what allows someone to survive the longest. In other words, if I simply hoard my resources so that I can survive, I would survive longer than someone else would, and therefore the most selfish person, or the most selfish gene, the name of a book that came out recently, is the one that is preserved. Problem is that in computational theory and in computer theories, we've actually tested a couple of ways in which that particular belief is actually erroneous. They actually reference this particular program, and it's a program called Tit for Tat. There was a computer competition in which someone had to program what society would be the most likely to survive after a significant period of time. Well, Tit for Tat was one that ended up scoring very highly. And the way that this particular computer program was written was, if someone shows generosity to you, show generosity to them. If someone attempts to harm you, harm that person back. So, in other words, it's tit for tat. It is give back what you receive. However, there was a computer program that defeated tit for tat that was called generous tit for tat. And the only difference between those two programs was the following. The program was told if you are generous, if someone is generous to you, be generous back. But this is the key. The next thing was said that if someone attempts to take something from you, then to ignore at random one of those slights. And the thing that was proved by this was that it was not simply selfishness, in other words, whatever serves me the best. If you're generous to me, then I'll be generous to you. If someone harms me, I'm going to harm them. What's best for me? But rather, there was an element of forgiveness which is what that was. It was randomly forgetting, which is, as one computer science programmer has noted, forgetting is the closest the computer gets to forgiving. But randomly forgetting one of those slights actually rendered a more robust society in which everyone was able to live within their means. What that shows, contra Dawkins, is that actually the forgiveness aspect of religion is, you could make a significantly strong sociological argument, is actually the more accurate way that we have to live within the sociological world of human interactions, as opposed to the assumption that we had about evolutionary biology in past years, that simply to be selfish is the best way to survive. It actually turns out that that's not the case. So, to illustrate this point, Dawkins's book, as Polkinghorne and others have pointed out, largely is arguing against a straw manning of what God is in probably the worst possible thing, possible entity in the universe. And therefore what happens is that Dawkins' God is a reprehensible actor. You would not want to serve Dawkins' God. And as N.T. Wright, New Testament theologian, has pointed out, when he talks with people sometimes about not believing in God, he says he sometimes finds himself saying to the person, I also don't believe in the God that you don't believe in. Which is perhaps the most accurate way of describing Dawkins's book. Dawkins's book, The God Delusion, argues against a particular, certain, pathological belief in God that is not accurate to the way that Christians, Jews, Muslims actually believe in a monotheistic God. It is what we call a straw man, an argument that is easily knocked down, but a straw man that is also not true to what the actual beliefs or arguments of theism is. As much as the book had promise, Polkinghorne and others have noted that it fails in actually grasping what Christians, Jews, and Muslims actually say about God, and therefore becomes little more than a rant to the insiders and a perhaps entrenching of those who already do not believe God is plausible, or who already believe that God is not a part of the equation. If the eternal time that God inhabits carries on along some sort of linear path, like our time appears to us, i.e., there is a before and an after in heaven, which would appear to be the case from the reading of Revelation, then surely it is impossible for an infinite amount of this time to have passed prior to the beginning of our universe. Is this something to do with our perception of time? Could it be that the time of our universe sits in relation to all of eternity like a finite line superimposed onto an infinite axis? If so, does God sit at all points on this infinite axis at the same time? If so, can he create beings with free will? If the question that was just asked is confusing, the way that we can sum up this question is the following. If God exists in all eternity, how are we to say that God experiences time then? How can we say that God, in all infinite of time, is infinitely present within every single bit of that time? And how does that apply to the way that we think about whether humans have free will or not? Now, I'll refer to you to some of the earlier questions, because we actually just dealt with God's providence as it comes to whether we have free will. The concept of time in this case really does have some import to this, because if God, in the infinite that God exists in, creates a finite, that which is limited and measurable, in other words, if God in his infinite timelessness created that which has time or experiences time, then do we say that God made the whole thing all at once and already knows everything that's going to happen within this creation? Is everything already determined? Now, here's an important thing about this. In the Christian tradition, we also believe, at the same time that we believe that God is eternal, and there is an eternity in God's existence, God is not contingent upon the universe existing for God to exist. God's existence in the infinite of all that God inhabits creates the finite, the created universe, that which is fundamentally different than God, but that in which, in the Christian tradition, God is intimately involved in, intimately relationally involved in. And so this avoids a couple of problems, which is that God is, number one, not the deist sort of God, in which God is way up here, out there, and has created this universe and has let it go and doesn't have anything to do with it. But also, God is interacting with this universe in deep, intimate fashion, not merely in the miraculous, but in the mundane as well. Hence why Thomas Aquinas, in the medieval time period, can say that God is the very reason why there's anything at all, and is the reason why anything continues to be at all. There is an active sustaining of the creation, not merely a creation then let it go. So does that mean that when God created all that is in the finite universe from his infinite point of view, does that mean that everything is determined already? Well, on the one hand, Polkinghorne wants to say that we can never know that. We can never take a God's eye view, because we simply do not have access to that information. However, we can look at the biblical examples of this interpersonal, intimate connection with the creation and see that, in some mysterious way, shape, or form, humanity has been given a will and a capacity to act in accordance or out of accordance with God's perfect plan. In God's perfect will, there is a perfection in which we can perhaps see in the original creation of the Genesis story. Whether you take it literally or not, there's simply a goodness of creation. This is, by the way, what is unique about this particular creation myth, and that the createdness of the universe, the physical stuff of the universe, was a good thing, as opposed to, let's say, the Enuma Elish, which is another creation story of Mesopotamia, in which the physical aspects of the universe were created by a dead god's dead body. And it's actually, it's literally true. That's what the Enuma Elish says about it. If we were to say that God has a certain amount of, let's say, limitedness, of which he is not limited by the creation, God has self-limited. If there's a certain self-limitation that God has taken on, such that his creation can have the capacity to make true, free decisions, then we also can say that there is a free will in the ways in which we interact with the world, in which we can say that, at least within the aspects of God's creation, there is a perfectly applicable aspect of which the universe is not simply determined, but has the arising capacity to self-make. This is a language you'll find in Polkinghorne later in this book. The reason why that's important is because it, number one, avoids us saying that we can say exactly how God functions, and it also avoids by saying that, well, it simply doesn't matter what I end up choosing to do. This is already my fate, so to speak. God both is eternal and also self-limits, which, by the way, in the Christian tradition is exactly how we interpret Jesus. God's own self-limiting of his divinity to become truly one of us and to experience all of those things that God is not supposed to have to experience. Hunger, tiredness, the changes of the world, and likewise to be subject to the evils of the world, such as the crucifixion. So, can God create a finite while being infinite and still have free will function? Christian theologians will say yes, and so does Polkinghorne and Nicholas Beale. But there's also an aspect in which this is somewhat of an unknowable question. Perhaps it's one of those questions that we can ask on the other side of heaven when we get there. Thinking of time as a dimension, I imagine it unfolded from God's perspective in an instant at the moment of creation. We are experiencing only the present moment, and similarly only the part of the universe near us that our senses can perceive. but God sees it all at once. I wonder if you could briefly explain why you find it necessary that God should limit his omniscience in order that we have free will. When we ask the difficult question of what does it mean for God to be all-powerful, all-knowing, so on and so forth, and yet to say that creatures have free will, this question asker is getting at a tension that we have to explore, which is that if God perfectly foreknows everything that will happen, in other words, if God knows perfectly what my actions will already be tomorrow, even though I have no idea what my actions will look like tomorrow, how can we ever say that my free will is actually free? Because if God, following the line of logic here, if God perfectly foreknows, then God knows the actual future that will happen. If God knows the actual future that will happen, and I, in my various ways, shapes, or forms, am going to fall into that future anyway, no matter how I try to dig my way out of it, does that really mean that I have free will? For example, like we used a couple times ago, if I'm making coffee and I press the on button, does the water have any choice but to start boiling? Well, this actually has to do with our conception of what it means to know the future. The reason why this is very interesting is because pop culture is really, really interested in this question right now. And I want to give an example as to why the pop culture is very interested in this right now, and it has to do with Marvel, the Infinity movies. It was the movies that had to do with Thanos and all of the Avengers having to beat Thanos. In the second part of that particular two films, Thanos has won in the first film. The Avengers were defeated. And Thanos was able to do what Thanos wanted to. Half the universe is gone. Well, in the second film, you have the concept, the wonderful literary concept of the time heist. You are going back in time to fix something that happened to change the outcome of the future. Now, the interesting thing about this, and there have been philosophers, as well as one of my very good friends from university who has written a paper about this, is that depending on how you think time travel works, actually is very determinative of how we philosophize, how we experience the flow of time. And when that happens, we have a couple of theories that we are working with. We have a certain conception of what time is. Something is going to happen in the future, and we're going back to change something about the past so that an outcome in the future doesn't happen. And so, the same thing is going on in the Avengers movies. We're going back into the past to change some things around in order that we can change the future but not mess up the past. This is sometimes called a linear point of view as it comes to time. Linear time. There is one way that time can go and only one way that time can go. Now, interestingly enough, this is a particularly Western understanding of time, and this is not a universally held standard of time. There are cultures, our Jewish ancestors being one of them, that believe time is cyclical. It is circular. Things happen and happen again and happen again and happen again on this kind of cyclical term. And you can actually see that within the literary genres of the Bible itself, such as the people of Israel. Think about the people of Israel. The promise of the covenant is made to Abraham. Abraham believes God. Abraham then does things that show that he doesn't maybe fully believe in God, and then he suffers the consequences, and yet then God promises Abraham, again, I will give you a son named Isaac. And so then we have that. And we have Jacob. Jacob's a really good one, where Jacob believes in God, meets him at Bethel, wrestles with God, and then Jacob kind of tries to do some things on his own and then earns the consequences, and then he is renamed Israel, the one who struggles with God, and then they go down to Egypt after Joseph is made the governor of Egypt. You have to be set free because God's people are being set free from this bondage. And you have this great going into the desert in which God gives the law, and then people start sinning against the law, and then they have the consequences. You kind of get my point, right? Cultures don't always see time as operating the same way. And the way that we understand time and the way that we think about time is so very important as it comes to how we think or don't think we have free will. In the concepts of linear time, it would seem that for God to perfectly foreknow something and for us to have free will would be in conflict with each other. However, to kind of go back a little bit to Polkinghorne's own sort of mathematical thinking about this, we have to think in terms of God's self-limiting for the purpose of humans having free will. But at the same time, Polkinghorne is going to say that God is not required to self-limit his foreknowledge in order for us to have free will, because knowing something perfectly is not the same thing as determining something perfectly. In other words, I can perfectly foreknow that the coffee is going to reach a boiling temperature, and yet I don't cause it. It's the element that caused that or doesn't. So there's a polarity in here that's difficult to kind of suss out, but perfect foreknowledge is not the same thing as determining the outcome. And that's the little nuance that Polkinghorne wants to answer this question with. I noticed that John Polkinghorne talked of destiny and predestination in one of his books, but how can the universe be free when Paul himself speaks of predestination? Romans chapter 8. The concept of predestination has a long and storied history within the Christian tradition, and it comes from none other than the Bible itself, particularly when St. Paul is referring to God's perfect intention that all might be saved through Jesus Christ. Those who have been predestined from the beginnings of the world to be the elect. Now, the thing about this is, it has to do with our concepts of how we think God predestines something. If we take the original intention of Paul, perhaps, the intention was to make a soteriological claim, a claim about salvation. And the claim about salvation that Paul is making is that it was God's perfect intention that those be saved through Christ. That is a question of salvation. It's, I think, important to note, Paul is not making a sweeping philosophical claim here. What Paul is particularly saying specifically in his letters to that congregation is that there are those who were in the perfect intention of God predestined by grace to be saved by Christ. The real question, I think, is, and I think this is pointed out by Nicholas Beale and John Polkinghorne, is instead, what exactly does it mean for us to have free will in the concept of God making creatures, and making creatures such as us humans to love? The interesting concept of love in this case, especially within the delving into this in a more psychological point of view in the 20th and 21st century, reveals that love in its very nature is a self-limiting or self-sacrificial sort of action. It is an altruistic action. It's something that, by its very nature, means that we do something for the good of someone outside of ourselves. And in this particular case, it involves, as any parent might understand, the allowing of the child to make their own decisions, even if those decisions we perfectly know that the decisions that some of our children make are harmful to themselves. And so it's a very hard question to talk about as it comes to predestination, but perhaps we can think about it in a relational sort of example. I can know for absolute certain that it is going to hurt in order to have surgery. I can know for absolute certain that if any of my children had to have surgery, let's say for appendicitis, I have had appendicitis before, I know how painful that is. But I also know that if that particular pain of going through surgery and medication and things like that is not endured, I actually will not only be worse off, but I actually have the chance of dying because of a burst appendix and because of the infection that can cause by that. So the thing that I can say about this, at least from the personal perspective, is that I can say for absolute certain that surgery is the right thing to do in that case, even though surgery causes pain and destruction of tissue. However, in the longer term sense, I know for a fact that enduring that pain and having the surgery is something that saves my child's life. So, in the sense of love in that case, my love, even though from the perspective of my child is simply, I'm going through a lot of pain, I know, as hard as this is, that to go through that means that you are coming to a more healthy place in the aftermath of that, from the parent's perspective. Now, we can treat this maybe as an analog for how God in his infiniteness, his infinite love for the creation, can infinitely allow for his creation to go through hardships with the full foreknowledge that in the long run, this is in fact the way that we are saved, or that we are made whole. By the way, the word saved or salvation actually has the word salve in it. It means to heal something. So we can maybe analogically say that God, in his predestination, does not remove our free will from it, but rather God, in his perfect foreknowledge of predestination in the Pauline sense of being saved, rather is that we go through the choices, times, and chances that we make, as good or as bad as our choices might be, in the end, that all might be made whole. There's a lot more that needs to go into that, and a lot of disagreement that goes with that, but once again, predestination, in the sense that we're talking about it, is not incompatible with being able to have free will. And there are all kinds of theologians that would argue in the affirmative for that. And Polkinghorne wants to say that we don't have to be pigeonholed into not believing that we have free will simply because God predestines. I wonder what John Polkinghorne thinks of the Euthyphro dilemma. The dilemma simply suggests that either A, God is the very source of all morality, in which case we are forced to concede that good and evil are simply arbitrary things that God chooses to condone and condemn respectively, or B, morality exists on a more fundamental level than God, in which case we are forced to concede that God is not the source of all morality, and that, presumably, there are certain things he cannot do, i.e., those things that have been defined to be evil without reference to God. Is this a problem for Christians? Or is this simply a false dilemma, in that there are more than two possible options, and we have just been presented with two that suit the argument? This particular question is a dilemma for certain kinds of theisms. Because if you think about this, if we say that God is the source of all things, God has created all things, including morality, then what does that mean? Does that mean that God has arbitrarily created a morality in which good and evil are simply arbitrary depending on God's mood? Or is morality even more foundational than God is? In other words, if there was a prior condition of the universe such that morality has to be followed by God's rules, does that mean that morality determines what God's rules are? Do you see how this is important? Did God arbitrarily create morality, or did morality have to be a precondition for God's creation, and therefore is therefore a prior entity to God? Well, the Christian answer to this question is actually quite simple, because in other theisms this is a problem. In Christian theism this is not a problem. And the reason why it's not is because God in both his being and action are perfectly united and are equivalent to each other. This might seem completely abstract to say, but let me give you an example. Thomas Aquinas said this, that God's essence, his esse, is completely identified with his action. And therefore, God's being is his action is his being. What that means is, God, by God's very being, acts a certain way. Now, that in and of itself might seem abstract, but watch this. God's perfect being is good. There is no evil in God. Therefore, by that very logic, the action of God is never evil. God can never commit evil actions because it is not God's existence. It is not God's person. And because we say that God's esse, his essence, is exactly his action, then we can say, without a shadow of a doubt, that God cannot, therefore, commit certain actions. God cannot contradict himself, because God's very being and God's very action cannot be in competition with each other. Therefore, God cannot commit evil actions. God is perfectly good. And therefore, God being perfectly altruistic, perfectly loving, God can never commit that which is an unloving action. And this is the thing, in that because we have these sort of data points for us in the Christian tradition, we can say for absolute certain that this particular problem for theism is not something that is necessarily a Christian problem. Instead, this is something that we can very clearly say, God wills that which is perfectly loving for the creature. God acts in that which is perfectly loving for the creature, and in that perfectly loving sort of way, God, in his free will, self-limits his interaction, not because he cannot do something, or not because he does not know something, but because, after his own existence, he is perfectly loving, and therefore perfectly forgiving, at the same time as being perfectly just. This is an important point when it comes to how we are saying whether God is truly the beginning of all things. And we can say within the Christian tradition that God is the grounds for all morality, because true morality is always and ever will be after God's own person. There is no moral action that is not reflective of God's very person. And therefore, Aquinas says this as well. There are natural laws of the universe, natural laws of ethics that we can discern is of God's nature. This is why we can have the humanitarian revolution of the 20th century and say that there are universals that we can understand about God's perfect being within the universe that is reflective of how we are supposed to treat each other. What about the Trinity? Or the question of, is the Trinity real, or is it simply a concept? From a scientific point of view, especially in modern science, what I want to say about this is that in the rising of the Enlightenment, in the scientific revolution, one of the assumptions that we made earlier in our scientific development is that there was this aspect of perfect control, a perfect amount of objectivity, of which either logic was or of which experiment was, that there was this perfect set of objective standards in which we could reach by our rationality, in which we could then take that and apply it to the rest of the universe in a way that is controlling. We are able to control that which is going on within the world, or a hyper-individualist sort of way of understanding the ways in which the universe functioned. However, interestingly enough, in the rising of evolutionary biology in the latter 1800s, and likewise in subsequent theories and testing and things like that, we have discovered, up to this contemporary point in time here in the early 21st century, that there is cooperation at the very fundamental fabric of the way that all of the universe functions. There's not this individualist sort of controlling principle, that there is this perfect control by a singular principle over everything, but rather there is a complex and, some would say, beautiful web of cooperation that is, at least in some kind of mathematical senses, almost built into the architecture of the universe. There's not one thing within the universe that is not cooperative with something else in the system of which we live in. And this deep concept of cooperation in the universe also has an aspect of mystery to it, because there are things about the cooperation of the universe that work that we simply don't know how it works. To give an example, one of the things that we were so baffled by whenever we were making these discoveries was how light can act as both a wave and a particle. The reason why this is important is because when light is striking something, it is, even in that language, light is hitting something. And we know that light can hit something by the way in which we are able to perceive anything. Light hits my cassock and gives off a certain wavelength that I am perceiving as the color black. That's a wavelength that's being given off there. However, the problem is that when light strikes something, it actually really is hitting something. This is, by the way, how we can measure thermal heat as it comes by the sun. When particles or waves are actually hitting something as if they are a solid piece of the universe, except that waves can pass through stuff too. So, how can light behave both like a particle and a wave? The answer is, it just does. And we're not entirely sure, even right now, why it has those characteristics. We just know that it does act that way. Same thing with quantum physics. How can something be both an on and an off at the same time? How can something be both a yes and a no at the same time? Like I said, quantum physics is something that I have a little bit of experience in as a pre-engineering major, but not to nearly the extent that the mathematicians do. But all of these things are cooperative with each other, but not fully understood. In the Christian tradition, the development of the theology of the Trinity was based off of real, spiritual revelations. And it has to do with both the relationship between God the Father, the Son Jesus Christ, whom people had real interactions with, spoke with in a real fashion, experienced real and bodily, and also the sending of the Holy Spirit, of which was a real presence and power that was really given to the apostles, that had real revelatory implications for the church, and continues to do so today. The theology of the Trinity is actually, perhaps interestingly enough, scientific in the ways in which we understand that there are cooperating principles that are unified together by this perfect altruism, this perfect love, this perfect cooperation with each other, such that everything is able to work and move and have their being. The mystery of the Trinity is not ascientific. It actually, weirdly enough, is deeply scientific and actually reflects how science sees the world even to today. There are cooperating principles that we know exist in the universe because we see them interacting, but we don't perfectly know why. We don't perfectly understand how, but we simply do know that there is a mysterious way in which these things work. Such is the way that the Trinity is. And such is the way that the Trinity is not merely a fun concept that Christians came up with, but was an actual experienced reality that required some scientific explanation.